a lot of folks who are really awesome intersectional feminists doing great activism and social justice work, who nevertheless have a really big piece of the puzzle that they're missing when it comes to diet culture. And they'll talk about the so-called obesity epidemic, and they'll talk about food as if it's this thing that could cure every ill or cause you to die, drop dead at any second if you eat the quote unquote wrong thing. And they just don't see how it connects to this larger system of oppression.
Yeah.
That diet culture is its own, system of oppression in its own right. And it's also born out of and connected to these other larger systems of oppression like racism and sexism.
Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. Hello, everybody. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the podcast. And most importantly, welcome to season 3. I released 2 episodes in honor of the beginning of season 3. So hopefully you'll catch the other episode I released as well. But maybe if you are a longtime listener of Reclaim, you caught on that there's a new intro, a more evolved intro, may we add, to the vision of Reclaim. As I evolve, the podcast evolves, and I'm really excited to continue to bring to you amazing conversations from women all over the world on what it means to reclaim our messy lives. On this podcast, we really talk about all facets of woman's psychology and what does it mean to be a woman in the modern age. And I'm just so thrilled that I get to interview these incredible beings all over the world. And also for all of you for listening to this podcast. I really, truly, without a doubt, would not be where I am without all of you supporting me, listening, sharing these episodes. It really warms my heart. It's part of what makes this so amazing for me. So thank you, all of you, for everything that you do for the podcast, including supporting the podcast on Patreon. All of the money that you give to the podcast from Patreon goes directly back to the podcast. It's what helps pay the editor. It's what helps create the new songs and all of the things. So if you love this podcast and you want to see its sustainability and you want to see it grow and get better and better, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can learn more at patreon.com/Thais Sky. So let's see, this particular interview with Christy Harrison is super good. I love Christy and I love the work that she does as an anti-diet registered dietitian, nutritionist, and certified intuitive eating counselor. Whew, that's a long title, but dieting, food, body image, wellness. This is the world that I come from. I started as a health coach. That's how I kind of got into the whole entrepreneurial online conversation and space, was because I was blogging about yoga and blogging about my disordered eating patterns. And through that blogging, through those conversations that I had with some of the most amazing people through Twitter at that time, that's what allowed me to connect to the world of wellness and health. And that's when I decided to go and become a health coach. And when I started my journey on becoming a health coach, my thoughts were, there's a lifestyle, there's a way that we can relate to food, there's a way that we can think about ourselves and think about food in a way that allows us to never have to diet again. And if we kind of relate to food as a source of nourishment and nutrient, then of course we want to be very discerning about what we eat. And if we discern what we eat and if we eat properly, then we're going to look skinny. We're going to look good. We're going to look and feel the way we always feel like we were born to look and feel. So that was kind of my understanding of health at the time that I started the route of becoming a health coach. And at that time, I was navigating my own disordered eating, and I was healing through doing a lot of inner healing. And I got to the point where I was finally no longer feeling like the disordered eating was consuming my life. But there was always just this thought of like, yeah, I want to be healthy, right? Like healthiness is important. It's pivotal. It's instrumental. Like being healthy is the goal of life. Like we want to be healthy. And so once I started kind of shifting away from health coaching and moving towards life coaching and doing deeper kind of emotional wounding work, and now as I'm training to be a therapist, so much of my understanding of what it means to be healthy and what it means to be well has changed. And I realized that so much of the ways that I had seen the world was through a lens of fatphobia, which is a cultural lens that tells us that if you are fat, then you're unhealthy. You know, if you're fat, it's a metric of your willpower. It basically says that you're sloppy and lazy. And if you're skinny, it means that you're healthy. And if you eat well, you're going to lose weight and you're going to be healthy. And those narratives, as I will explore in my conversation with Christy, is not only antiquated, but it's also inaccurate. And there's a different way that we can be looking through the world that doesn't perpetuate fatphobia and ableism and narratives that cause a lot of harm. A population of our culture that receives a tremendous amount of harm through the conversation of wellness and health and diet and body image are larger bodied people. And it's important that we understand, all of us, just how this way of looking at the world truly harms one another. It harms ourselves. It keeps us in our own prison, but it also harms other people. And so it's important for us to kind of start to really investigate of what it means to be fat, what it means to be skinny, what it means to be healthy, so that we can find our own balance, our own relationship with food and body that feels good for us. And I've had multiple conversations about this sort of stuff on the podcast before. You can catch the episode with Sarah Sapora. Sarah talked a lot about what it means to be aging and to be fat and to be on social media and really act like an active proponent of taking up space as a woman. I love the conversation with Sarah. I also have episode with Sarah Thompson, who now goes by SJ. SJ shared a lot about their thoughts on what it means to be fat, what it means to be anti-diet, what it means to navigate the complexities of class and weight. So that's a really potent conversation. And I'm going to have some other dietitians and other people talking about health and wellness on season 3. So you can keep your eyes out for that, or your ears, I guess, out for that. But anyway, let's bring Christy on. Let's have this conversation. Let me read to you Christy's bio. So Christy, like I said, is an anti-diet registered dietitian. She offers online courses and private intuitive eating coaching to help people all over the world make peace with food and their bodies. Since 2013, Christy has hosted Food Psych, a podcast exploring people's relationship with food and paths to body acceptance. I highly recommend Food Psych. The link is in the show notes. I think that podcast is really important and really well done. And it is now one of iTunes' top 100 health podcasts, reaching tens of thousands of listeners worldwide each week. Good for you, Christy. I love it. Christy began her career in 2003 as a journalist covering food, nutrition, and health. And she's written for and edited major publications, including Gourmet, The Food Network, Refinery 29, Slate, BuzzFeed, Modernist Cuisine, and many more. As an expert on intuitive eating, health at every size, and people's relationships with food, she has been quoted in top media outlets, including The Washington Post, Self, Health, Refinery 29, Men's Fitness, Bon Appetit, The Observer, and more. Now, the cool thing is Christy's coming out with a book called Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating. And that is coming out January of 2020. And I will also be putting the link in the show notes if you want to pre-order now. Okay? And you can learn more about Christy at christyharrison.com, also in the show notes. So as you're listening to my conversation with Christy, I want you to be thinking about the insidious ways in which you connect with people through food, not the obvious ways, right? Because I think we look at food as a connection with people. We love to go get drinks with people. We love to go get food with people, and that's like a very beautiful way that humans connect with one another. But I want you to start to really explore, how do you relate with other people around food that doesn't necessarily have to do with sharing a meal. And I share some of my stories on the podcast. So I want you to be thinking about that. Like, how is your relationship with food influence your relationship with other people? And what type of relationship do you want to have with other people and food in a way that feels really good for you and it feels expansive and feels like you're not perpetuating diet culture or fat phobia or ableist thinking. All right, let's bring Christy on. All right, Christy, welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm so grateful that we've made this interview happen.
Me too. I'm really happy to be here.
It's been, first off, you are a busy lady, which is fabulous. And I can't wait to hear all about the book that you're putting together. It's available now for pre-order, which is really exciting. I want to hear about it. But been going back and forth with your assistant and then my schedule, your schedule. So I'm just eternally grateful for all of the gods that have helped to make this conversation between you and happen, because I love your podcast. I love your work in the world. And I'm so grateful that you're doing the work that you're doing. So first, let me just thank you so from the bottom of my heart for everything that you do. I know it's not easy, and I just really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. That really means a lot.
So you're writing a book about diet culture. So I would love to hear just why this particular topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think it goes back to everything that I've been working towards in my career and in my own personal journey for more than a decade now, because I am recovered from my own eating disorder, disordered eating, whatever you want to call it. It's sort of nebulous because it was never diagnosed, but I think could have been diagnosed at a particular point in time in my early 20s back in 2003, 2004. And then I spent a decade or, almost a decade in disordered eating, which was clean eating, orthorexia, whatever you want to call that, right? The sort of obsession with healthy, quote unquote, healthy eating. And through that experience and then my subsequent work in helping other people heal from eating disorders and disordered eating, I started to look at the cultural factors that are causing people to fall into this pattern with food in the first place, and pattern with their body, really. And a lot of our issues with food and the reasons that we feel so at war with food often have to do with feeling at war with our bodies. And looking into this, the cultural roots of this more and more, people talk about it a lot in my field. People talk about, they throw around the phrase diet culture. They talk about the diet industry, pressures that people face from the media. All this stuff is sort of discussed and known in the field, and there's literature and research on it. But I wasn't finding any book that really delved into like, what exactly is diet culture? Where does it come from? What's the history of it? How does it affect people today? There are books out there that look at parts of that and snippets of that, but that often end up in a place that still actually falls within diet culture, because a lot of the pre-existing literature on this is like, diets are bad for you, diets will never work. Here's the history of the diet industry. Here are all these cultural forces pushing you to hate your body and to have a terrible relationship with food. But you should also lose weight in a quote unquote healthy way. Like, that's the conclusion they end up at. And I'm just like, no, like, where's the book that I can recommend wholeheartedly to people to truly understand this without triggering people back into eating disorders and disordered eating, without doing more of the same, without keeping people stuck in diet culture? And so I started looking at, how does diet culture show up in these insidious ways? How does diet culture show up in the sort of tacked on last chapter of a book about the horrors of the diet industry that says, but quote unquote, obesity is still terrible for people's health? Like, that's diet culture too. So I started looking at those manifestations of diet culture, those sneaky, subtle forms. And in my work with clients, I teach a practice called intuitive eating, the first principle of which is reject the diet mentality. And intuitive eating was created, it's a philosophy that was created back in the 1990s by two wonderful dietitians who've been mentors of mine, Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch. So I didn't invent this practice. And in fact, humanity sort of invented this practice, because intuitive eating is like the way that we're all born knowing how to eat. It's really the
Mhm.
default mode. And it's what diet culture and being on diets really strips away from us. But,
Mhm.
in teaching intuitive eating and coaching about intuitive eating and counseling people in this practice, the thing I saw time and time again was that first principle, reject the diet mentality, is by far the hardest and
Mhm.
by far the longest road, and you keep having to sort of circle back to that in your practice of relearning intuitive eating. And that it shows up in such sneaky and subtle ways where people can think, especially now, my practice and my work is so centered around helping people heal their relationships with food, that's kind of what all my marketing is about. People know me for that. And I have lucky to have a wait list on with my practice. And so by the time people start working with me, they've usually been following my work for a long time, and they've been thinking that, oh yeah, I've given up dieting, I'm not a dieter anymore, I've rejected the diet mentality. And then inevitably, when we start doing the work, when we really dig in together, we find all of these hidden ways that they're still dieting that they
Mhm.
didn't think they were.
Mhm.
The portion size that they serve themselves, they automatically think it should be a portion size that they serve themselves on diets. Or
Mhm.
certain foods are still off limits, even if they're eating them, even if they have these foods in the house all the time, they're still thinking of them as bad. They're still judging themselves as bad for eating them, even if they're technically allowing them. So
Mhm.
all of these little ways that people are actually still at war with food are, things that we have to uncover, and all the ways that people are still subtly dieting. And
Mhm.
so when I think about that, it's like, where do these things come from? Where do these subtle forms of the diet mentality come from? And they really come from this overarching system of beliefs, which is diet culture. Culture really is a system of beliefs and values. And specifically, diet culture is a system of beliefs and values that privileges thinner bodies over larger ones, right? And, denigrates and stigmatizes people in larger bodies. It demonizes certain foods and food
Mhm.
groups while
Mhm.
elevating other food groups, right? So that's how we get, you know, processed foods are bad and dirty and sinful, and
Mhm.
clean eating is where it's at, and that's the moral way to be, and that's the quote unquote healthy way to be.
Mhm.
And this system of beliefs also ends up oppressing people who don't match up with its ideals for how bodies are supposed to look, right? The size that they're supposed to be, and also how people are quote unquote supposed to eat. The sort of demonization of certain foods and elevation of others. So people who don't match up with those cultural ideals that diet culture puts forth are oppressed, and it really disproportionately affects women, people assigned female at birth, feminine people, and also people of color, of course people in larger bodies. And of course, the larger you get on the size spectrum, and size really is a spectrum, it's a form of diversity like any other human trait. But as you go up the size spectrum, people become more and more oppressed by
Mhm.
these fat phobic beliefs that are so present in diet culture. And
Mhm.
so, just looking at those things, right, that this system of beliefs like really has these black and white ways of thinking about bodies and about food, and oppresses people who don't match up with those black and white beliefs, and that really nobody can match up with those beliefs, and we're all chasing this elusive ideal, even the people who seem to be quote unquote closer to the ideal. And I've
Mhm.
seen dozens, if not, hundreds of people over my work with clients in this field who look like diet culture's supposed picture of health, quote unquote. They're
Mhm.
thin, they're able bodied, they're going to the gym all the time, they're posting pictures of themselves with these, cute workout clothes and green smoothies or whatever. And by diet culture standards, or modern day diet culture, which I've dubbed the wellness diet, because it pretends not to be about a diet, it pretends to be all
Mhm.
about wellness
And lifestyle,
and
right? It's
lifestyle.
always about a lifestyle. Yeah.
Yes, it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle change, right? And, so people who are in that camp, people who are following that diet and look like that diet's supposed picture of health, are often struggling the most, are often the most unwell, the sickest people that I see. And they don't get help, they don't get called out for it. They actually get compliments and get people asking them what their secret is, and just fanning the flames of the disorder. And meanwhile, they're locked in this painful struggle behind the scenes with food in their body, that's made all the more painful by the prestige and sort of praise that they get from diet culture. So, as I've just continued to like pull back and ask, why is this? Like, why are we here? Why, sort of looking behind each cause, really I've come to see that diet culture is at the root of all of it. Diet culture is the root of why we struggle so much in our national and the world's relationship with food at this point.
Hmm. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing all that. It's amazing how insidious diet culture is, and how it's insidious, this belief, this kind of like knowing that women are supposed to struggle with food in their bodies.
Mhm.
And I've navigated my own relationship with my disordered eating, and I'm at the point now, after a lot of deep healing work, that I don't participate in the same behaviors that I used to. I don't have restrictions, and I don't count calories and all these things. And yet I still find myself sometimes making comments that I do as a form of connection to people, but I know is perpetuating diet culture. Just yesterday, for example, I have no problems anymore with compulsive eating. Right, that's where my origins of my eating disorder is, this ability of not being able to stop, right?
Mhm.
And so I was gathered around a conference room, having a meeting, and there was this plate of cookies, and I was eating a cookie, and I was like, I'm gonna have a second one. And I went and grabbed the second one, and I whispered to my colleague, I was like, push that plate away, make it harder for me to get it. Right, again, I had no compulsion to eat it. I was doing it very mindfully, and I knew what I was doing. And wondered, why did I say that? I know that
Mhm.
I want to connect with this woman, but why did I have to connect it over something that's not actually quite funny, and perpetuating a belief that isn't real, isn't true, isn't what I want to support. And it's amazing at how she smiled and laughed in a way that's like, oh, I understand you.
Mhm.
I know, I'm with you on this, in this pain. And so it almost feels like diet culture is a way that women connect with one another.
Yes.
And it's a way that we can bond, the way we can see each other, the way we can say, I got you. And I feel like that makes it all the harder to not want to participate in it, because then it's very isolating. Like, if all my friends are talking about diets and all my friends are talking about, and I don't want to talk about that stuff, then what am I going to talk about? How am I going to connect with women?
Yeah, absolutely. I so identify with that too, and have gone through my own sort of mourning process of having that point of connection with other women
Mm,
and increasingly people of all genders in this society, because it's just
mhm,
diet culture has become so pervasive. And yeah,
mhm,
I think I think that sort of um, the way in which diet culture functions as like cultural currency among women also goes back to patriarchy.
mhm,
And the writer Naomi Wolf wrote The Beauty Myth in I think it was 1995 it came out, so this was 30 years ago. And she had this incredible line that's one of the most famous lines about diet culture, really, as I see it, is that dieting is the most potent political sedative there is. A
mhm,
quietly mad population is a tractable one. And
mm,
I think she said the most potent political sedative in women's history, actually.
mm,
And making the point that at each point in history when women have gotten more rights, gotten the right to vote in the 1920s, gotten the reproductive rights in the 1960s with the advent of the pill, started entering the workplace in greater numbers. Each of those points in history has resulted in sort of a quote unquote coincidental, but not actually coincidental, reduction in the size of the ideal, quote unquote, ideal body for women. Such
mhm,
that, in the 1920s, it was the flapper aesthetic that became popular then, right after women got the right to vote. And diet culture was really ramping up already by then. Fat phobia has its roots as well in racist beliefs and in sexist beliefs about, which bodies are worthy and valuable and more quote unquote evolved, or what's the word I'm looking for, being socially acceptable. And that actually goes back to the late 1800s. I have a whole chapter on this in my book about the history of diet culture, and I just think it's so fascinating, the different roots of it. But really, the roots are very deep in, deeply planted in racism and patriarchy. And
mhm,
so I think the fact that specifically women and femmes, tend to connect over dieting behaviors and these sort of self deprecating comments about our bodies is
mhm,
really emblematic of the fact that this is a system of oppression that's designed to oppress us disproportionately. That's designed to keep us so fixated on food and our bodies and hating ourselves that we don't take our rightful place in the world and change things for the better and shake things up. Because
Mhm.
if, as Naomi Wolf said, if we're too busy hating our bodies, basically, we're not going to go out there and smash the patriarchy. I have a line in the book,
Mhm.
it's hard to smash the patriarchy on an empty stomach or with a head full of food and body concerns. And
Mhm.
that's exactly the point of diet culture. But
Mhm.
one of its points really is to keep oppressed people oppressed and to make already marginalized people even further marginalized. And of course, we see this with, I know I have the privilege of living in a relatively thin body, and I know you've spoken about this on your podcast as well, that you do too. But there's intersections of oppression, right? So people who are both, in a larger body, much larger body, who are maybe people of color and women or femmes or trans folks who are further from this sort of mythic ideal of what a person quote unquote should be in our racist and sexist and cis sexist and homophobic patriarchal society,
Mhm.
um, have compounding marginalizations because of all of these identities that are oppressed. Each identity has its own oppressions.
Mhm.
So I think it's really, and it's so ingrained too, because we do have a hard time stepping away from that, even in like feminist communities. And especially I see that with diet culture. I feel like in feminist communities, like definitely not to paint with too broad a brush, because there's still a very strong like white feminist sort of not getting intersectionality part of modern day feminism. But I think there's also, a lot of folks who are really awesome intersectional feminists doing great activism and social justice work, who nevertheless have a really big piece of the puzzle that they're missing when it comes to diet culture. And they'll talk
Yeah.
about the so-called obesity epidemic, and they'll talk about food as if it's this thing that could cure every ill or cause you to die, drop dead at any second if you eat the quote unquote wrong thing. And they just don't see how it connects to this larger system of oppression.
Yeah.
That diet culture is its own, system of oppression in its own right, and it's also born out of and connected to these other larger systems of oppression like racism and sexism.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how insidious it is, the belief that obesity equals unhealthy. It's pretty amazing at how people don't really question that, how it's become so mainstream belief that now it's gotten to the point where our fear of getting fat, our fear of becoming obese, um, we don't see how much that fear is keeping us trapped in a cycle of distrusting our needs, distrusting our bodies, distrusting desire, distrusting our cravings, our longings for food as nourishment, for food as so there's this fear that like you can't seek comfort in food, that you're not allowed to, because food is meant to be something that promotes health, and if there's any psychological connection to food, then that means maybe something bad's going on, right? It's just so easy for us to tie our worth to how far away we are from being quote unquote obese. And I don't know if we really realize until we become more aware just how harmful that is to people in larger bodies, and how um, just how that belief, while it stems from this idea of health, is actually the most unhealthy thing.
Oh, yes. So well said. I mean, it really is amazing how this belief has just come to be taken as gospel that
Yes.
fat equals unhealthy, right? And
Yes.
that's just something that we're taught from birth. It's the water we're
Yes.
swimming in. So we're steeped in that constantly so that none of us really question it until we're forced to question it, maybe. But yeah, it's, when I started looking into this, I mean, I have a master's in public health. I'm a registered dietitian. So I
Mhm.
trained and was steeped in that rhetoric pretty hardcore. I mean, I
Mhm.
actually went back to school. My first career was as a journalist, but I went back to school to become a dietitian and get that master's of public health at a time when I was still in this orthorexic state, in this disordered eating state of wanting to, shrink my own body and eat quote unquote perfectly and tell other people how to do the same
Mhm.
and cure the quote unquote obesity epidemic. Those were my
Mhm.
motivations for going into this work. And fortunately, I was able to recover and heal my own relationship with food through a lot of self help, but also therapy, really great therapy with a psychotherapist who just really got me and understood how to deal with the underlying issues of lack of self worth and
Mhm.
inability to trust myself and lack of self compassion in order to help me get back to that intuitive relationship with food and being able to trust my body's needs, trust my hunger, trust my fullness, trust my desires for food, trust that I was allowed to have satisfaction, I was allowed to have enough, I was
Mhm.
allowed to get my needs met. And so that was such a gift, and that was such a privilege too, to be able to afford that kind of therapy. But I went back to school when I was not recovered, when I was not healed, and was drinking the Kool-Aid. Like, so
Mhm.
I totally empathize with and identify with anyone who has that belief and is like, no, but fat is just unhealthy. That's just how it is. Because 10 years ago, I was there too. I refused to believe that there was any other way of looking at things at the
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
And as I've started to get into, I mean, really, the turning point for me was starting to work with people healing from eating disorders and starting to look into the research on that and to look into what was triggering to people with eating disorders, what was helpful to people with eating disorders, and starting to see, like, oh, interesting. We're telling people with eating disorders all of these things that sort of square with my experience of healing and recovery. And yet we're telling people in larger bodies to do the exact opposite. Basically, we're telling people in larger bodies to do the behaviors that people with eating disorders do.
Mhm.
Why is that? Why are we prescribing, as Deb Brigard, one of the founders of the Health at Every Size movement, says, why are we prescribing to people in larger bodies what we diagnose as an eating disorder in people in smaller bodies? Like,
Mhm.
why, what's up with that? And
Mhm.
the more I started to ask myself that question and dig into the research, the more I found, oh wow, this connection that we take for granted, that we take as a foregone conclusion between higher weight and poor health just doesn't hold up under scrutiny, just doesn't have the scientific backing that we're told that it does.
Mhm.
And really, the science that shows, there are certain diseases, yes, for which being in a larger body seems to be a risk factor. There are other diseases, by the way, including, I mean, mortality is not a disease, it's sort of an event or condition, but mortality, the risk of death, is actually lower in people in larger bodies. And certain other diseases, the risk is lower in people in larger bodies. But for the diseases where there does seem to be a higher risk for people in larger bodies, say heart disease or diabetes, the evidence for that is really based on correlation and not causation.
Mhm.
And the interpretation of, okay, well, we see a correlation here between higher weight and these unfavorable health outcomes. Instead of asking, why is that, what are some possible explanations for that, and looking at the cultural bias against people in larger bodies, maybe explaining that, which we now have a ton of evidence to suggest is true, that actually weight stigma is a bigger risk factor to your
Yes.
health than weight itself. And
Yes.
also dieting, chronic dieting and weight cycling is a bigger risk factor to your health than weight itself. But instead of looking at those other reasons, for a century and a half now, our medical field has just been like, well, it's because fat causes poor health. Duh, right?
Mhm.
Like, this sort of framing of it is like, well, the fatness is the cause.
Mhm.
And interestingly, before 150 years ago, the thinking was the exact opposite. The thinking was, oh, it's actually beneficial and healthy for people to gain weight as they age. It's favorable and good for health and well being, not to mention aesthetically pleasing for
Mhm.
people to be in a larger body. We actually, in the Victorian era and before, people preferred larger bodies in general in Western culture. There was even in the medical field this idea that, it was if someone was trying to, in the early days where weight loss started to become a fashion because of other cultural forces pushing it in that direction, the sort of denigration of larger bodies through racism and sexism started to mean that there are individual people trying to lose weight, trying to shrink their bodies. And then a very famous one, very famous dieter named William Banting published what's sort of the first best-selling diet book in history in the 1860s. And interest in dieting and shrinking one's body took off. But at
Mhm.
the time, doctors actually thought, oh, that's just vanity. That's just, that's bogus. That's bunk.
Mhm.
That's not supported by sound science. And we actually, need to focus on real pressing health issues. So we need to, like, these patients who are coming in wanting weight loss, it's just like such a waste of time.
Mhm.
And it was not until the early 1900s when the idea of larger bodies being bad had sort of been around and been building in this way for 40 years or so, that doctors started to cave and started to like give the people what they want. Because what does any business owner do when faced with an overwhelming demand and so many of their patients coming in and saying, I want to lose weight? Eventually they give the people what they want.
Mhm.
Then, it was not until after the 1920s or so that there was ever any quote unquote science supporting weight loss for health, or that supporting this idea that higher weights led to poorer health. And that was well after the cultural bias against fat has been established in society. And it really makes sense because, scientists are people too, doctors are people too. They're subject to the pressures of culture and the whims of fashion like everyone else. And when they do research or when they talk to patients, they're taking in all of that cultural learning that they've absorbed and that cultural bias in the way that they see things.
Yeah.
And they're, spitting it back out to their patients or in their research. And so this idea that, higher weight equals poor health is actually bogus, and the research that supposedly supports it goes back to this shift
Mhm.
where it was really pushed by fashion and culture rather than any scientific evidence at all that higher weight was bad for you.
I am so glad that you brought this in, the science, because I sometimes get a little annoyed when somebody says, well, science says, because we often forget that it's humans behind the science. Sometimes I think that we idealize science as something beyond human, right? Like something so logical and based on facts. But we forget that science is prone to human error because it's created by humans. And there was a point in time when science proved that women were hysterical and crazy, right? There was at one point, there was science that proved that Black people were inferior to white people because of the size of their brains, right? And at that point in time, it was science. It was, this is why white people are superior. And so I think it's important as consumers that we scrutinize what does science mean instead of taking it as a gospel, taking it as the only truth or fact, is to really get curious as to what does the paper say? Is it causation? Is it correlation? And what is like really understanding, like, who is this written for? Who stands to benefit for this type of research? Who's backing this type of research? Who's paying for this type of research? I think we need to, as consumers, particularly the more marginalized identity we carry, to be really, really, and I think that this happens already in so many ways, and in so many ways we've kind of internalized culture's voice, and so we forget to do this, but to really question when things become mainstream. Because I find that anything that becomes, actually, Erica Hart said this on the podcast, and says it on their on their Instagram page frequently, that like if anything is in the mainstream, they question, because st- most of the times it doesn't stand to support people with more marginalized identities.
That's such a great point. And yeah, this, especially when it comes to the quote unquote science, like you said, it's just done by people, and it's and
Yes.
it's so political.
Yeah.
Science, I mean, science is of great value in certain cases. There's definitely, like I think there's an argument to be made that we would not be here having this conversation if it weren't for modern medicine keeping us
100%.
alive, right? Like,
Yes.
I mean, I would have died of an ear infection as a baby, probably,
Mhm.
Um, and so there's many things for which I'm grateful for science, but also I think we need to, yeah, be much more critical consumers of it. And that's hard because that does take education. Like,
Yeah.
I actually spent 7 years as a food and nutrition and health journalist, working in the field, reporting on food, nutrition, and health for major magazines, for big websites and stuff that were getting, articles that were getting shared around a lot. And I didn't have any background in science really. I mean, I
Mhm.
had taken like, biology in high school and stuff, but I majored in rhetoric and French literature in college. And I went straight from there into my first job as a journalist. And I was just interested in health and nutrition because I was starving. Let's be real.
Mhm.
Like, I was, I
Mhm.
was, restricting myself and binging and trying to figure out, what was behind it. really obsessed with food because of it. And that's why I got interested in that area of journalism. But even as a reporter, even with all the, information and like sort of job, on the job training that I got and learning in how to report on health and nutrition research, I still didn't actually learn how to read a study, like how to critically read a study. And I'm not just talking about the abstract, I'm talking about the whole study and looking at the methods and looking at the results and looking at, not just the introduction and the discussion. I didn't learn how to do that until I got my master's degree. And
Mhm.
I spent literally hundreds of thousands of dollars getting that
Mhm.
education. So,
Mhm.
like, there's a huge amount of privilege too in being able to understand and parse science.
Yeah.
And I think that's a part of it that's so difficult and problematic too, is that
Yes.
like the average person can't understand what the science actually says, what the study actually says. And then we have these health and nutrition journalists who are very much oftentimes themselves, and I would argue, even more so than the general population, caught up in diet culture,
Yeah.
and they're doing the interpreting for the general person, general population who doesn't have that advanced training in how to read the literature. And oftentimes those health journalists, not all the time, but I would say a majority of the time probably don't have any advanced training themselves in how to read a study or parse the information.
Yeah.
And they're often just writing these things based on an abstract or even a press release about the study. They're not writing it based on like detailed review of the actual study itself.
Yeah.
And that's what's then getting disseminated to the public in the form of these scaremongering headlines like research says if you eat X, you'll live less, you'll die sooner, or research links consumption of XYZ food to a certain form of cancer, blah, blah, blah. These things
Yeah.
that get people's attention, that get people to click, that get people to buy newspapers and magazines. And so it really feeds on itself.
Yeah.
And the public gets more and more frightened and scared and looks and feels like they can't trust themselves to make food decisions. And
Yeah.
so then looks to these so-called authorities in the form of nutrition media or doctors or scientists. Sometimes they look at the research, but more often than not, it's kind of looking to the media and to doctors or even Instagram quote unquote wellness influencers and people with blogs and stuff like that. And then those people are sort of responding to the demand for more fear mongering stuff by putting out more fear mongering stuff and by saying like, yes, processed food will kill you, and look at this new ingredient that you need to be afraid of. And
Yeah.
so we get this like heightening and fomenting of fear about food, and it really has cultural roots more so than roots in actual reality.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad that you brought that up. I think it's so um, interesting how easy it is to kind of find research and find things that just support your point of view instead of kind of challenging and questioning what you believe. And that's why, there's a lot of people out there who say when you do your research, when you're trying to learn something new, really make sure that like you're kind of understanding that you're probably going to find more things that support what you already know.
Hmm.
And that can lead into kind of a closed loop circuit, where you're just kind of continuing to feed on the same information. um, and so I'm glad that you brought that up, that yeah, it is very privileged for us to be able to understand and parse out studies and what it means and the research, and like really get to the nitty gritty. And that's why I'm so grateful for people like you who are making that information accessible for people, and who are having these conversations so that the general public has um, more resources and more places to get information. And I think that is a perfect segue um, to ask you a little bit more about your book. When is it coming out? How can people get their hands on it? What does it look like, et cetera, et cetera?
Oh, yes. I'm so excited to talk about the book. It's like all I think about these days.
Oh, I'm sure it is.
Yeah, I'm like in the middle of the final edits. So it's like,
Oh, that's so exciting, Christy. How does it feel to have written a book?
it feels amazing. It feels like what I've always wanted to do. I mean,
Hmm.
as I said, my first career was as a journalist, and from a very young age, like before I could even write, before I could hold a pen, I was dictating books to my parents, and I
That's
was
adorable.
telling everybody I wanted to be an author when I grew up. So,
Oh,
it's like it's the dream. It's the dream come
yeah.
true finally to have written a book, and I'm planning on writing many more. So But yeah, it feels great. And the book is called Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating.
Oh,
The
you
word
have reclaimed
reclaim
the word
is
on
the
there, which
title.
is perfect. Ah, that's so exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's such an important word too, I think, because, to me, as I sort of alluded to before, intuitive eating really is the default mode. It's how we're all born knowing how to eat. And our relationship with food by default is really peaceful. And it's, diet culture and other forms of deprivation like food insecurity or trauma, those things really take away that birthright, take away what is
Mhm.
rightfully ours. And so
Mhm.
in order to heal our relationships with food and our bodies, I think reclaiming that birthright is so important. But also, diet culture steals these things from us: time, money, well-being,
Mhm.
happiness, and
Mhm.
all these different ways, all these insidious, sneaky ways. And so to be able to reclaim those things and really reclaim our lives as a whole for bigger and better things than just food in our bodies, we really need to reject diet culture and, as I argue in the book, really burn it to the ground and plant something new in its place. And so, that's kind of what the book is about. It's structured around, the history of diet culture and then how it shows up in modern day, the sneaky modern day forms that it takes. And then looking at how it steals our time, our money, our well-being, our happiness, and then how we can fight back, looking at all these different tools that, are available to us as individuals, but also arguing for a larger social change. This is not just about us as individuals recovering. It's not an individual responsibility for us to heal our own relationships with food and our bodies. Certainly is worthwhile work and an endeavor that can lead to really fruitful things on the other side. But it's not enough for each of us to have to go through these individual journeys alone. We really need to be changing society and changing things at the root so that people don't have to go through this in the first place, so that people don't have to go on these, heroes journeys of healing their relationships with food and reclaiming what is rightfully theirs. And we need to, as a society, be able to support people's rights to autonomy and connection and self-worth with food and with their bodies so that they can be free to do all the other things that they want to do in life, including change the world, topple the patriarchy, dismantle racism, dismantle, cis heteronormativity, and all the rest.
I love it. Well, I'll make sure to add your book to the show notes so people can get their hands on it. When is the official release date?
It's January 7th of 2020.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah, people can pre-order now though, and it's at christyharrison.com/book. So if you go
Amazing.
there or to the show notes page, you'll get it.
Amazing. I'm so excited for you. And again, love the work that you're doing. Do you have any final words for listeners who are, like all of us, really, to all of the listeners who are actively dismantling diet culture?
Oh, yes. I would say it's a really long process. And, I think it's one thing to wake up to these ideas and to start to feel indignant and angry about all the ways that diet culture has robbed you of life. And I would say, don't rush from that place to like, okay, how am I going to fix it in my own life? How am I going to recover? I think that, just sort of sitting in that place of building your awareness, building your
Mhm.
understanding of
Mhm.
all the ways that diet culture shows up for you without even necessarily changing anything right away is a really powerful experience. And of course, if you feel so moved to do so and just like ready to throw out your diets and so over it at this point, that's awesome. But I'm not asking anyone to do that right away because I know from my own experience, as I said, 10 years ago, I myself had like dug in my heels against any, openness to this idea that health at every size exists, that people in larger bodies can be healthy, but also that they don't owe anyone their health. And, all of these ideas that I now so strongly believe. So I get how much of a process it is to come out of diet culture. And I don't want anyone to feel like they have to rush it. You
Mhm.
can let these ideas percolate, you can let them take time. And really, as I always say, it takes time, practice, and support. I think those are kind of the three pillars of recovery from diet culture. Because time is just, you need time to percolate with these ideas. You need practice. You need to eventually start practicing giving up dieting and sitting with what comes up for you when you do that.
Mm.
And, putting that into practice in large ways and in small ways, right? So, smashing your scale, getting rid of your diet books, canceling your Weight Watchers or, sorry, WW membership, are kind of the big ways, but then the small ways too, right? Of, kind of noticing, like you were saying, right, those comments that you might make to other people about food and your body, and deciding like, okay, I'm going to make it, an intention of mine to try to be aware of when I say those things, and maybe see if I can redirect myself when I feel the impulse or the urge to say something like that. So that's the practice part. And then the support part is that we really need a community of other people who get it. And maybe that
Mm.
community is just on the internet at this point. Maybe everyone in your real life is still dieting, but you can find a community online that gets it and that's breaking away from diet culture and can help support you in that. Or maybe there are some people in your life that are already doing it, that are already on the anti-diet path too, or that are open to it and that you can sort of take this path with. And because, like you said, it's just a way that diet culture is a way that we bond, especially with other women. But I mean, trans folks are actually at the highest risk of eating disorders too. So it's, I think really anyone in sort of a marginalized gender identity
Mhm.
experiences this, right? That it's the dieting is sort of the norm. It's sort of expected. And I just had an episode of my podcast actually talking about diet culture in the gay male community, which is also very rampant. And, so sort of having a community that is opposed to that and that helps support you in going against the grain of the mainstream, right? The mainstream diet culture is so important. And I think with those three pillars, and again, it takes time to build that community too, right? But with enough time and practice and support, it eventually is possible to break free from diet culture and to live in a way that feels authentic, and that you're not, caught up in thoughts about food and your body all
Mhm.
day, every day, that you're
Mhm.
maybe thinking about food, 6 times a day or whenever you're hungry, right? But like you're not, you're not obsessing about it. It's not something that takes away your life, so that
Mhm.
you're ultimately free to do other things and really open your mind to sort of the bigger and better things that you're here on this planet for.
Yeah, I love that you said that because I know it's true for you and it's true for me. It is possible. I didn't think it was possible, 10 years ago. I thought I was gonna count calories until I die, And so the fact that it's become possible for me and it's become possible for you means it is possible. It truly, truly is possible. And I love that you mentioned community. I think it's a beautiful wrap up of this whole interview, that while it may be difficult to dismantle our internalized diet culture narrative because it's such a way to bond with other people, there are so many people out there who are on the journey of anti-diet culture, and they are out there and we just have to find them, like I found you. And a great place for everybody to go is your podcast, which is called Food Psych. I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to get to more, like connect with more and more people who are speaking this language and talking the talk and walking the walk. And go follow the guests that Christy has on. Like they are out there, and it's really, really exciting that this movement is continuing to build and get bigger and bigger. And I think it is possible to dismantle diet culture, and I know you do too, Christy, or else you wouldn't have written your book. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you, and I'll make sure to link everything up on the show notes. I appreciate you, and thank you.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much for having me here. This was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.